Although he was on good terms with everyone, he had not made a real friend. There was no one among his classmates for whom he felt any particular affinity, let alone fondness. And to their amazement, the others discovered in the fistfighter they had first taken for a rowdy, a peace-loving companion, a model student who seemed to be striving for scholarly laurels. There were two men in the cloister to whom Goldmund's heart reached out, who filled his thoughts, whom he admired and revered. Abbot Daniel and the assistant teacher, Brother Narcissus. He felt the abbot was a saint. He was immensely attracted by his kind simplicity, his clear, concerned eyes, by the way he gave orders and made decisions, humbly, as though it were a task, by his good, quiet gestures. He would have liked to become the personal servant of this pious man, to be in his presence constantly, obedient and serving, to bring him the sacrifice of all his youthful need for devotion and dedication, to learn a pure, noble, saintly life from him. Goldmund wished not only to finish the cloister school, but to remain in the cloister, indefinitely perhaps, dedicating his life to God. This was his intention, as it was his father's wish and command, and, most likely, God's own decision and command. Nobody seemed aware of the burden that lay upon the handsome, radiant boy, an original burden, a secret destiny of atonement and sacrifice. Even the abbot was not aware of it, although Goldmund's father had dropped several hints and clearly expressed the wish that his son remain in the cloister forever. Some secret flaw seemed attached to Goldmund's birth, something unspoken that sought expiation. But the abbot felt little sympathy for the father, whose words and air of self-importance he had countered with polite reserve, dismissing the hints as not particularly important. The other man who had aroused Goldmund's admiration had sharper eyes and a keener intuition, but he did not come forward. Narcissus knew only too well what a charming golden bird had flown to him. This hermit soon sensed a kindred soul in Goldmund. In spite of their apparent contrasts, Narcissus was dark and spare. Goldmund, a radiant youth. Narcissus was analytical, a thinker. Goldmund, a dreamer with the soul of a child. But something they had in common bridged these contrasts. Both were refined. Both were different from the others because of obvious gifts and signs. Both bore the special mark of fate. Narcissus took an ardent interest in this young soul, whose character and destiny he had been quick to recognize. Fervently, Goldmund admired his beautiful, outstandingly intelligent teacher, but Goldmund was timid. The only way he needed to court Narcissus was to exhaust himself in being an attentive, eager student. But more than timidity held him back. He sensed a danger to himself and Narcissus. It was impossible to emulate simultaneously the kindly, humble abbot and the extremely intelligent, learned, brilliant brother Narcissus. Yet every fiber of his youthful soul strove to attain these two incompatible ideals. It caused him much suffering. There were days during his first months at the cloister school when Goldmund's heart was so torn, so confused. He felt strongly tempted to run away or to take his anguish and anger out on his classmates. Sometimes a bit of innocent teasing or a prank would stir such a wild rage inside this warm-hearted boy that the utmost control was required to hold it in. He would close his eyes and turn away, silent and deathly pale. Then he would go to the stable and find Bless, lean his head against the horse's neck, kiss him, and cry his heart out. Gradually, his suffering increased and became noticeable. His eyes grew thinner. His eyes became dull. His face grew thinner. His eyes became dull. He rarely laughed the laugh. He really laughed the laugh all like so much. He didn't know what was happening to him. He was honestly determined to be a good scholar, to begin his novitiate as soon as possible, and after that to become a quiet, prayerful monk of the cloister. He firmly believed that all his strength and talent drove toward this mild, pious goal. He knew nothing of other drives. How strangely sad then to find this simple, beautiful goal so difficult to attain. Occasionally he would be discouraged, bewildered to detect hateful moods and tendencies in himself. He'd feel distracted, unwilling to learn. He'd daydream or drowse through a lesson, rebel with sudden distaste against the Latin teacher, be cranky and impatient with his classmates. And what was most confusing was that his love for Narcissus seemed to fight his love for Abbot Daniel. Yet at moments, he felt almost certain that Narcissus loved him also, that he was concerned about him, was waiting for him. Narcissus's thoughts were far more occupied with Goldmund than Goldmund imagined. He wanted the bright boy as a friend. He sensed in him his opposite, his complement. He would have liked to adopt, lead, enlighten, strengthen, and bring him to bloom. But he held himself back for many reasons, almost all of them conscious. Most of all, he felt tied and hemmed by his distaste for teachers or monks who all too frequently fell in love with a pupil or a novice. Often enough, he had felt with repulsion the desiring eyes of older men upon him. He had met their enticements and cajoleries with wordless rebuttal. He understood them better now that he knew the temptation to love the charming boy, to make him laugh, to run a caressing hand through his blonde hair. But he would never do that, never. Moreover, as a mere tutor, with the rank but not the position or the authority of a teacher, he had become especially cautious and watchful. He was used to conducting himself with pupils only a few years younger than himself, as though he were 20 years their senior, to forbidding himself sternly all partiality toward a pupil, to forcing himself to particular fairness and concern for those pupils who were naturally repugnant to him. His was the service of the mind, and to that he dedicated his strict life. Only secretly, during his most unguarded moments, did he permit himself the pleasure of arrogance. No matter how tempting a friendship with Goldmund seemed, it would only be a danger. He must never let it touch the core of his existence. The core and meaning of his life was to serve the mind, to serve the world, the quiet, superior, self-negating guidance of his pupils, and not only of his pupils, toward high spiritual goals. For a year or more, Goldmund had been a student at the cloister of Maria Braun. He had played some 100 times with his classmates under the linden trees, in the courtyard, and under the beautiful chestnut tree ball games, races, snowball fights. Now spring had come, but Goldmund felt tired and sick and often had headaches. He found it hard to stay awake in class, hard to concentrate. Then one evening, Adolf came up to him, the classmate he had first met during a fist fight and with whom he had begun to study Euclid that winter. It was in the hour after supper, an hour of recreation when the boys were permitted to play in the dormitories, to walk and talk in the outer cloister yard. Goldmund, he said, pulling him down the stairs after him, I want to tell you something funny. But you're such a model student. You'll probably end up a bishop or one of these days. First, you might give me your word of honor that you won't tell the teachers on me. Goldmund immediately gave me his word. There was cloister honor and student honor, and occasionally one contradicted the other. Goldmund was well aware of that, but as anywhere else in the world, the unwritten law defeated the written one. He would never try to evade student laws and codes while he was himself a student. Adolf dragged him outside the arch under the trees. There was, he whispered, a group of good, strong-hearted classmates. He himself was one of them, who were carrying an old student tradition of reminding themselves that they were not monks. They would occasionally steal away from the cloister for an evening in the village. It was the kind of prank or adventure no decent fellow could avoid taking part in. Later during the night, they would sneak back again. But the gates are locked at that hour, Goldmund objected. Of course they were locked. Precisely. That was the fun of the whole thing. But there were secret ways to get back inside, unnoticed. It wouldn't be the first time. Goldmund recalled hearing the expression, going to the village. It stood for boys' nocturnal escapades, for all kinds of secret adventures and pleasures which were forbidden on the path of heavy punishment. He froze inside. Going to the village. Going to the village was a sin, something forbidden. At the same time, he understood only too well that that was precisely why the regulars considered it a point of honor to take the risk, and that it was a certain distinction to be asked to join this adventure. He would have liked to say no, to run back and go to bed, but he felt tired and weak. His head had ached all afternoon, but he felt slightly embarrassed in front of Adolf. And who could tell? Perhaps there would be something new, something beautiful outside the cloister, something that might make one forget headaches and listlessness and all kinds of pain. It was an excursion into the world, although secret and forbidden. Nothing to feel proud of. Still, perhaps it would bring release, be an experience. He stood undecided while Adolf continued to talk. Suddenly, he laughed and said yes. Unobserved, they slipped out under the linden trees in the vast darkening courtyard. The outer gate had already been locked. Adolf led him to the cloister mill, through which one could easily sneak out, unseen in the twilight and unheard because of the constant whirring of wheels. In complete darkness, they climbed through a window into a pile of slippery, wet planks, one of which they pulled out and used as a bridge to cross the little stream. And now they were outside, on the pale, glistening road that disappeared into the dark forest. All this was exciting and secret. He enjoyed it very much. At the edge of the forest, they found a third classmate, Conrad. They waited for a long time and were joined by a fourth, big Eberhard. All four tramped through the forest. Night birds rose above them in a rustle of wings. A few stars peeked wet and bright through quiet clouds. Conrad chatted and joked. Occasionally, he'd make the others laugh. But there hung above them the solemn anxiety of night that made their hearts beat faster. After barely an hour, they came to the village on the other side of the forest. It seemed asleep. The low gable shimmered faintly, crisscrossed by dark ribs of timber. There wasn't a light anywhere. Adolf led the way. Silent, on tiptoe, they circled several houses, climbed a fence, stood in a garden, sank into the soft earth of a flower bed, stumbled over steps, stopped by the wall of a house. Adolf knocked at a shutter, waited, knocked again. There was a sound inside. Soon a light shone, the shutter opened, and one after the other, they climbed into a kitchen with a black hearth and an earthen floor. A tiny oil lamp was standing on the stove, its feeble flame flickering on a thin wick. And there was a girl, a haggard servant girl, who stood holding out her hand to greet the intruders. Another girl stepped out of the shadows behind the first one, a young thing with long black braids. Adolf had brought gifts for them, half a loaf of white cloister bread and something in a paper sack. A handful of stolen incense, perhaps, thought Goldmund, or candle wax or the like. The young girl with the braids went out of the kitchen, groped her way through the darkness to the door, stayed away for a long while, returned with a jug of gray clay with a long blue flower painted on it, and offered the jug to Conrad. He drank from it, passed it on. They all drank. It was strong apple cider. In the light of the tiny lamp, they sat down, the girls on rigid little stools, and the students around them on the floor. They spoke in whispers, with interruptions for sips of cider. Adolf and Conrad making the most of the conversation. From time to time, one of them would get up and caress the hair and neck of the older girl and whisper into her ear. No one touched the younger girl. The big one was probably the maid, Goldmund thought, and the smaller, pretty one, the daughter of the house. But what difference did it make? It was none of his business, and he would never come back here. The secrecy of the escapade, the walk through the night forest, had been beautiful, out of the ordinary, exciting, but not dangerous. Forbidden, yes, but even so, the transgression did not burden one's conscience. Whereas this, visiting girls at night, was more than just forbidden. He felt it was a sin. Perhaps for the others, even this was only a small adventure, but not for him. He knew that he was destined for the ascetic life of a monk, and playing with girls was not permitted to him. No, he would never come back here. But his heart pounded with anguish in the flickering half-light of the poor kitchen. The others were showing off in front of the girls, and spiking their talk with tidbits of Latin. The servant girls seemed to like all three. They would slide up to her with their awkward little caresses, a timid kiss at most. They seemed to know exactly how much was permitted, and since the whole conversation had to be held in whispers, there was something rather silly about the scene. But Goldmund did not see it that way. He crouched on the floor and stared into the flickering flame of the lamp, not saying a word. Occasionally, a slightly eager side glance would catch one of the caresses the others were exchanging. Stiffly, he stared straight ahead again. More than anything else, he would have liked to look at the younger girl with the braids. At no one but her. But that especially he forbade himself. And every time his will slackened and his eyes strayed to the sweet, quiet face of the girl, he found her dark eyes riveted on his face, staring at him as though she were spellbound. An hour may have passed. Never had Goldmund lived through a longer hour. The students had exhausted their conversation and caresses. They sat in embarrassed silence. Eberhard began to yawn. The servant girl said it was time to leave. They stood up, shook her hand. Goldmund last. Then they shook hands with the younger girl, Goldmund last. Conrad was first to climb out through the window, followed by Eberhard and Adolf. As Goldmund was climbing out, he felt a hand hold him back by his shoulder. He could not stop. Once outside on the ground, he slowly turned his head. The younger girl with the braids was leaning out of the window. "Goldmund," she whispered. He stood and waited. "Are you coming back?" she asked. Her timid voice was no more than a breath. Excuse me. Goldmund shook his head. She reached out with both hands, seized his head. Her small hands felt warm on his temples. She bent far down until her dark eyes were close before his. "Do come back," she whispered, and her mouth touched his in a child's kiss. Quickly, he ran through the small garden, toppled across the flower beds, smelled wet earth and dung. A rose bush tore his hand. He climbed over the fence and trotted after the others, out of the village toward the forest. "Never again," commanded his will. "Again, tomorrow," begged his heart. Nobody surprised the night owls. Nothing hindered their return to Maria Braun. Across the little stream, through the mill, across the square of linden trees, along secret passageways, over gables, around window columns, into the cloister and the dormitory. Big Eberhard had to be punched awake in the morning. He was sleeping so heavily. They were all on time for early mass, morning soup, and assembly in the auditorium. But Goldmund looked pale, so pale, Father Martin asked him if he were ill. Adolf shot him a warning glance, and Goldmund said he felt all right. But during Greek, around noon, Narcissus did not take his eyes off him. He, too, saw that Goldmund was ill, but said nothing and watched closely. At the end of the lesson, he called him, sent him on an errand to the library to avoid rousing the student's curiosity, and followed him there. Goldmund, he said, can I help you? I see you are in trouble. Perhaps you're not feeling well, in which case we shall put you to bed and send you some soup and a glass of wine. You have no head for Greek today. For a long while he waited for an answer. The pale boy looked at him out of troubled eyes, hung his head, raised it again. His lips quivered. He wanted to speak but could not. Suddenly he sank to one side, leaned his head on a lectern, between the two small oak angels' heads that framed the lectern, and burst into such violent weeping that Narcissus felt embarrassed and averted his eyes for some time before touching the sobbing boy to raise him up. All right, he said in a voice that was friendlier than Goldmund had ever heard from him. All right, amicus meus, you just weep. It will soon make you feel better. There, sit down. There is no need to speak. I can see that it has been too much for you. It was probably difficult for you to stay on your feet all morning without letting anyone notice. You've been very courageous. Weep now. It is the best you can do. No? All finished? Back on your feet so soon? All right. We'll go to the infirmary then, and you'll lie down. And by evening, you'll feel much better. Let's go. He led Goldmund to the sick room, careful not to pass any study halls on the way. He pointed to one of the two empty beds and left the room when Goldmund obediently began to undress and went to the superior to have the boy put on the sick list. He also ordered the promised soup and a glass of wine at the refectory. Two special treats the cloister habitually allowed the ailing, who enjoyed it greatly when they did not feel too sick. Goldmund lay on the bed in the sick room, trying to think himself out of his confusion. Something like an hour ago, he could perhaps have explained to himself why he felt so indescribably tired today. What deathly strain on the soul drained his mind and made his eyes burn? It was the desperate, constantly renewed, constantly failing effort to forget last night, but not the night itself, not the foolish, enjoyable escapade from the locked cloister, or the walk through the forest, or the slippery makeshift bridge across the little black stream behind the mill, or the climbing over fences in and out of gardens, through windows, sneaking along passageways. But the single second outside the dark kitchen window, the girl's words, her breath, the pressure of her hands, the touch of her lips. But now something new had occurred, another shock, another experience. Narcissus cared for him. Narcissus loved him. Narcissus had taken trouble over him, the refined, distinguished, intelligent young teacher with the narrow, slightly sarcastic mouth. And he, Goldmund, had let him break down in front of him, had stood before him in stammering embarrassment, and had finally started to bawl. Instead of winning the superior being with the noblest weapons, with Greek and philosophy, with spiritual heroism and dignified stoicism, he had collapsed in disgraceful weakness. He'd never forgive himself for it. Never would he be able to look Narcissus in the eye again without shame. But his weeping had released the great tension. The quiet loneliness of the room and the bed were doing him good. The despair had lost more than half of its impact. After an hour or so, one of the lay brothers came in, brought a gruel soup, a piece of white bread, and a small mug of red wine, which the students normally drank only on holidays. Goldmund ate and drank, emptied half the plate, pushed it aside, started to think again, but couldn't, reached for the bowl once more, ate a few more spoonfuls, and when, somewhat later, the door quietly opened and Narcissus came in to look after his patient, Goldmund was asleep, and a rosy glow had already returned to his cheeks. Narcissus looked at him for a long time, with love, curiosity, and also a slight envy. He saw that Goldmund was not ill. There would be no need to send him wine tomorrow, but he knew that the ice was broken, that they would be friends. Today it was Goldmund who needed him, whom he was able to serve. Another time, he himself might be weak and in need of assistance and love, and from this boy he would be able to accept it, were it to come to that someday.